Welcome to Uplifting Life Talk Show with your host, Rita Robinzine. Hello, everyone out there in TV and internet land. I am so happy to be with you again this week. I wonder how many of you learned a new hobby while we had to shelter in place due to COVID. Maybe you improved on one of your hobbies. If you love to quilt or want to learn more about quilting, then today's show is just for you. I am so happy to have as my guest today my Spelman sister, Michelle Kearney Willis. Michelle Kearney Willis is a self proclaimed quilt artist and third generation quilter raised in Scottsdale, Georgia. Michelle has been quilting since 1997 and was first introduced to quilt making by her paternal grandmother, the late Lois Howard Jefferson, but was introduced to quilts by her maternal grandmother, the late Early May Kearney. Michelle's quilts have been displayed at Fernbank, the Atlanta History Center, the North Charleston Arts Festival, the Atlanta Quilt Festival, and the Lucy Laney Museum, and have traveled in exhibits with the South Carolina State Museum. In 2011, her quilt, Wine and Cheese, was recognized as the judge's favorite in an Atlanta exhibit at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. In 2015, her quilt, Sankofa, won second place, Best in Show at the Atlanta Quilt Festival. In 2019, her quilt, Phenomenal Women Mathematicians, won third place in the African Heritage Quilt category at the Atlanta Quilt Festival. One of Michelle's greatest compliments regarding her quilts was from a lady who has lost most of her hearing. Upon seeing Michelle's Bargello quilt, made of vibrant shades of purple and black, hanging in her church sanctuary, the lady commented that while she may not be able to hear the worship service, she is able to worship with the quilt. Michelle is a founding member of the Brown Sugar Stitchers Quilt Guild and is chair for their upcoming 20th anniversary celebration. Welcome, Michelle, to the Uplifting Life Talk Show.
Thank you so much, Rita. This is so exciting for me. I can never say no, first of all, to a Spelman sister. And I can never say no to anyone interested in hearing any stories, anything about quilting. Like you already mentioned, I've been quilting or involved in quilting pretty much all of my life because of my mother. And it's just such a part of me and my life. This is the first time I've allowed the public into my most precious place in my house, which is it is now my quilting studio, but it was once the boys' playroom, and now that they're all grown and all, I've just taken over all of it. And made this into my very special place to create, to meditate, to relax, and I spend a lot of time here. So.
Okay, cool.
Much.
Well, how old were you when your paternal grandmother, Ms. Lois Howard Jefferson, introduced you to quilt making?
Oh, I was probably in my early 30s. What happened, my grandma Lois gave each of our boys quilts when they were born. My grandmother's health wasn't that well when my son was born, so on the way home from the hospital, we stopped so that she could at least get a peek at him and offer her blessings to him. And as the tradition has been, she presented him with a quilt. 18 months later, my second son was born, and it was pretty much the same ritual. And I found myself home with these two little babies. They were cute, but they didn't offer a lot of entertainment. So I was looking for something else to kind of keep me busy. And I knew my grandmother would not say no to teaching me how to quilt. So I kind of thought I was surprising her by going out and getting the supplies that I thought I needed to make a quilt. And that was my first lesson of, finding out that I really knew nothing about quilting. I bought way too much fabric. I'm 20 plus years later, I think I still have some of that fabric around the house. It was not the right kind of fabric for quilting, but it served its purpose. I'd like to share something else because a lot of times people really don't understand what quilting is or what a quilt is. I've had a lot of people, tell me, "Oh yeah, well, my great aunt made me a quilt," and they'll show me something like this.
That's not a
This
quilt.
is
See, I know.
crocheting. This is done with yarn and a crochet hook. It is.
That's a blanket.
It would be a blanket or an afghan,
Okay.
but it's not quilting. Another thing, that people have shared with me is something similar to this, which again, this uses yarn, but this is knitting. And knitting
Uh,
is done with knitting needles.
okay.
And on the one hand, I'll say I've been fortunate that I have a mom who introduced us to hand embroidery, knitting, crocheting, painting ceramics, acrylic painting, watercolor painting, just about every craft you can think of. But she never introduced us to quilting. And I guess because her mom was the quilter, and at a point, I guess it was considered something that, the older generation did. So that's not something that I learned from my mom. But since I started quilting, I have introduced my mom to quilting, and now she is, it's just amazing. She's so creative anyway, and she already, was a expert seamstress. So quilting was not a challenge for her other than, she thought I was a tough teacher, but I just wanted to make sure she was following the quilting rules.
Okay.
Because there's not a lot of rules with quilting.
Okay. When did you discover you had a passion for quilting?
When I found myself thinking about quilting, sketching quilt patterns, just doing this all day, every day, I could not let it go. Similar to the knitting. When I was in high school, we would knit scarves and leg warmers, if you remember those.
Remember? So,
I had a pair for every day of the week. But it was a cyclical kind of thing for me. I, may do my knitting and then I may put it down for years. And then I may, paint for a while or do ceramics, and then I'll put that aside for years. With the quilting, once I got started, I could not stop. And I actually, this was in probably late, maybe 1999, 2000, or maybe 2000, going into 2000. I was interviewing for a new job. And I spent 4 hours interviewing the first day. They called me back the second day to interview with the rest of the team. So I spent another 3 or 4 hours interviewing. They offered me the job, but before I would accept, this is horrible, I needed to map out how close the nearest fabric store was. So we took a break. I drove over and I was like, wow, I could walk here during my lunch break. So I accepted the job.
that's funny. That's
So
funny.
yeah, it has been a passion from the beginning for various reasons. It's meditative to me. I had to show some discipline and do this after, the boys finished their homework, had dinner, and went to bed. So I found myself quilting, in the wee hours of the night. I remember my oldest son came home from school one day, and Rita, I started cutting fabric in the den. I was sewing in the dining room. I had other things that I started laying in the floor in the living room, and I needed a little more space. So I covered the stove. When my son walked in, he was
Oh,
like, "Mother, you are out of control." And I felt horrible because it has taken over the house. It has taken over my life. So I, try to keep everything contained to one or two or three rooms. But now, like I said, I have all of this space here. Um, and I have a lot of quilts and quilting related things in other parts of the house, but I don't have to hear anybody's mouth.
good. Okay. All right. What is the history of quilt making in general, and what historical impact does quilting have for African Americans?
Well, quilting goes back um, in the U.S. hundreds of years before slavery. Just in general, there have been archaeologists that have discovered things, um, clothes or robes. I want to say probably the oldest thing found was a statue of an Egyptian king, and I think it dates back to maybe 3 or 5,000 BC. And
Oh, okay.
there's the history of, like, in Egypt or China or even the Greeks are known to have done quilting, and it was more for garments, or more for um, like the protective wear under the military shields and things that they wore, and it was something that the men did more so than what it has become now, what it has evolved into, being more artsy and something that women mostly do. But for African Americans, there's still some controversy about how we started and where we started. And I think one of the most controversial things is around the Underground Railroad. And um, I'm sure you've heard the story. And one of the I guess most detailed books regarding that is this book, Hidden in Plain View.
Oh, okay. Wow. I
Love to
need to.
read, and I love music, but quilting has taken over my life. So I have a ton of books about quilting and magazines about quilting and stories and history, and I entertain myself with these every now and then. But as the story goes, the quilt the quilts were made, and those quilts um, included certain patterns that guided the slaves to homes that would provide safety to them while they were escaping to the north, or the quilts had patterns that gave them direction. Um, as far as the directions, there's a popular pattern called flying geese. Let me grab this. This is a sampler quilt that I started 23 years ago, and I'm going to finish one day. But this quilt has a lot of the
Oh,
patterns are talked about in the Underground Railroad. So
yeah.
let's see if I can show you this. These are flying geese, and so this would give the slaves that were escaping direction as the story is told. This pattern is referred to as a wagon wheel or a turn dash. And there's many variations of this pattern, but if this pattern was being displayed on a quilt, that was to let people know to get ready, start gathering your tools, and get ready for the next notice of what to do next. There's a lot of different, let's see here. There's a lot of different star related patterns or variations of star patterns, but of course, the North Star was a very important pattern for them to look for and to follow. So that's about all I'm going to say about the Underground Railroad.
A lot.
There's a lot of
Thank you.
controversy.
That was a little history lesson there.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I do want to say one more thing. For me, it's an easy enough story for me to believe. I mean, there are some people that feel that it should have been, better documented, or at least documented, and there should be proof. But it was supposed to be a secret, so I'm like, hey,
That's true.
I
It was. It's like the coded messaging behind the Negro spirituals. The same
yes,
thing.
exactly. So
Mhm.
I'm okay with it, and
Yeah.
it relates to quilting.
I actually saw that in a U.S. history textbook.
Oh, good.
So yeah, it has been documented.
There's a lot of traditional quilting similar to the sampler quilt that I was showing you. Those blocks that are used in the Underground Railroad quilts, that's more traditional quilting. Um, Here's an example of the turn dash block used over and over again.
That's pretty.
And I incorporated some hand embroidery.
Oh, okay. For Morehouse College. I think you may have shown it to me before. I'm not sure.
I probably,
I know you have one for Spelman too.
yes, yes. And speaking of that, this reminded me that I have quilts scattered about. I have 4 or 5 quilts in an exhibit in Augusta at the Lucy Laney Museum. I have quilts on display at the Purple Corkscrew Wine Shop in Avondale. I have a quilt that's on its way to the North Charleston Arts Festival. And I've got to do a better job of tracking where they are and they're coming back. It wasn't until I started looking for certain things that I realized they're not here. But I can't leave out Spelman. My oldest son designed this with the help of his grandmother and presented this to me one Christmas. He said that I make quilts for everybody else and I should have my own. So
that is so pretty. I love it.
And there's a lot of handwork, almost like cross stitch. My son did all of this. His grandmother taught him how to do this. It's called chicken scratch. And he would sneak off in his room and work on this. So this is my favorite.
That's so sweet. Oh, I love it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm sure a lot of Spelman sisters will want one of those. Well, do you do hand quilting or machine? Which one do you prefer?
Well, I prefer machine quilting. Hand quilting is very it makes my fingers hurt. Now
Hmm.
I have done um hand piecing and hand quilting. It is one of those techniques that as a quilter, we don't want these techniques and traditions to be lost. Um, it reminds me so much of what my grandmother's type of quilts that they made. And it reminds me of what the GBN quilters are doing. And, right now, I've gotten a call probably every day last week. The GBN quilters are on, Good Morning America, or they're on this show. And I had the privilege and the pleasure in 2006 to volunteer at the High Museum when their quilts were brought here and exhibited.
Tell me
And
a little bit more about them. Tell me a little bit more about that
the G
organization.
quilters, oh, I wish I could remember when they started, but there's a small town in Alabama, and um, earlier generations of these ladies, they lived on a plantation, and at a point they started making quilts, and I want to say it was probably in the 60s when they were being contacted by maybe like Sears to make quilts, and it was a way for them to earn money. Um, there were other organizations that reached out to them, but it probably wasn't until the late 90s, or well, I don't want to give dates, but I believe one of the quilters was photographed, and one of her quilts was in the background, or a quilt was in the background. And a folk art collector, William Arnett, I believe is the name, saw this picture and was determined to find this quilt and the quilters. And I guess he is the one who is credited for bringing the G's being quilters to the forefront. Um, he purchased a lot of their quilts. He created these exhibits across the country and probably across the world by now. One of the things when they were here in Atlanta, they spent about a week, and they, of course, did like workshops where they explained their technique of quilting. They explained, the why they quilted. It wasn't for art and it wasn't for show as much as it was for keeping warm, which I can relate to that. Having grown up in a house without central heat, um, you need these quilts to keep you warm. And even um, during the spring and summertime, the ladies continue to quilt so that when their daughters or even their sons, I guess, but when the kids married and they went to set up their own household, they would have quilts because they were needed. Um, so um, I was able to get one of these early copies of this book, and you can see how thick it is.
Wow, it is.
It talks about these ladies. I mean, the pictures are incredible. The history um, is incredible. The stories of their lives. I sat with these women. It reminded me of what we were taught to sit at the feet of the elders and learn from them.
Hmm.
And I have literally gone to bed with this book many times, just looking at the pictures, um, just being reminded of my grandmother's. And I don't think I brought it down, but the quilt that my grandmother gave me when I started college, it's very worn and it's very loved, and it is literally falling apart. and it stays on my bed year round. Um, when I was at Spelman, it unfortunately spent a lot of time in the trunk of the car. You never knew when we needed to go to John White Park for a picnic, so it was dragged around a lot then. But fortunately, as I got older and gained a greater appreciation for what went into making the quilt, I stopped taking it out of the house.
Mm.
I don't even take it for exhibits.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
but because it stays on my bed, and my children, of course, they know and understand how much it means to me. And my youngest son came in one day and he snatched it off of my bed and said, "Until you make me a quilt like this, I'm keeping your quilt."
He held it hostage.
He he understood that there was a difference between the quilts that my grandmothers made and the quilts that I was making, but he wanted one of those. And after Grandma Lois passed away, there were a lot of unfinished quilts. There were a lot of um, fabrics at her house, and a lot of those came to my house. And I'm still trying to figure out what to do with them, but I was able to get enough of Grandma Lois's fabrics and put this quilt together. This is hand quilted. I did sew
Ah,
blocks on the sewing machine, but
wow, that is so
holding
nice.
it together, these are hand stitched blocks made with a lot of love and a lot of pain. Sticking your fingers. I'm not great with using a thimble, but I got this done for my son, so
Oh, that's so
I
sweet.
know he will cherish this as well as the many other quilts around. But going back to the G's Bean quilters, there's a lot of interest in quilting now with us having been confined to home for the last year.
Mhm.
And the internet has allowed us to do what we're doing now, to virtually join with people. And that's something that those ladies are doing and have done.
I hope that you have enjoyed Michelle Kearney Willis talking to us about quilt making. If you want to know more, stay tuned because this show will continue next week for part two. See you then.